She nearly froze on Christmas Eve, until she begged the rancher to let her stay, as his wife Christmas Eve arrived quietly that year, wrapped in heavy clouds and sharp wind. Snow had been falling since morning, not gentle flakes, but hard, icy sheets that stung the skin and blurred the road. The world felt empty and unforgiving. Cars passed less often, houses were far apart, and most people were already safe inside, gathered around warm lights and familiar voices. But she was not. She walked slowly along the narrow country road, her boots soaked through, her fingers numb. Every step felt heavier than the last. Her coat was thin, bought years ago for a different life, back when winters were something to enjoy, not fear. Now the cold crept into her bones, making her chest ache and her breath uneven. She hugged herself, trying to hold onto what little warmth she had left. She had not planned to be here. Just a few weeks earlier, she still had a room, a job, and a sense that life, though hard, was manageable. But things had fallen apart quickly. The job ended without warning. The landlord wanted rent she could no longer pay. Phone calls to friends went unanswered, not out of cruelty, but because everyone had their own problems. Pride kept her from begging too much. Hope kept telling her something would change. But on Christmas Eve, hope felt thin. She stopped walking and looked around. The land stretched wide and white, fences half buried in snow. The wind cut across the open fields with nothing to stop it. Her legs trembled, not just from cold, but from exhaustion. She knew she could not keep walking much longer. Fear settled in, heavy and real. Not the loud kind, but the quiet kind that made her think, what if I don't make it through this night? That was when she saw the light. Far ahead, beyond a long stretch of fence, a warm yellow glow flickered in the distance. It wasn't bright, but it was steady. A house, or maybe a barn. Either way, it was shelter. She stared at it as if it might disappear if she looked away. Gathering the last of her strength, she began walking toward it, each step slow and careful. The ranch sat on a wide piece of land, surrounded by open fields and old wooden fences. It was the kind of place built for long winters and hard work. The house itself was simple but strong, with a porch that faced the road. A truck sat parked near the side, its tires dusted with snow. Smoke rose faintly from the chimney, a sign of life that made her chest tighten with relief. She reached the gate and paused, gripping the cold metal. Her hands shook so badly she had to wait a moment before pushing it open. As she walked up the path to the house, doubt crept in. What if no one answered? What if they turned her away? She had no story prepared, no plan, only the truth and the cold pressing closer every second. She climbed the porch steps and knocked. At first there was no answer. She knocked again, harder this time, the sound echoing in the quiet night. Her vision blurred, not from tears but from the cold and fatigue. She leaned against the door, her strength fading. Inside, the rancher had been sitting alone by the fire. He was used to quiet evenings, especially on holidays. His life followed a steady routine shaped by the land, the animals, and the seasons. Christmas was no different. He cooked a simple meal, fed the animals early, and settled in for the night with a cup of coffee and the sound of the wind outside. When he heard the knock, he frowned. Visitors were rare, especially on a night like this. He stood slowly, pulling on a jacket as he walked to the door. When he opened it, cold air rushed inside, along with a sight he did not expect. A woman stood on his porch, pale, shaking, her hair damp with snow. Her eyes met his, wide and tired, carrying a mix of fear and determination. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The wind howled behind her, pushing snow against the steps. "Please," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I just need somewhere warm." He didn't hesitate. He stepped aside and gestured for her to come in. She crossed the threshold slowly, as if afraid he might change his mind. The warmth hit her all at once, making her dizzy. She swayed, and he reached out instinctively, steadying her before she could fall. He guided her to a chair near the fire and handed her a blanket. She wrapped it around herself, her hands clumsy and stiff. He poured her a cup of warm water first, careful not to overwhelm her system. She drank it in small sips, her breathing gradually evening out. For a while they sat in silence. The fire crackled softly, filling the room with a gentle sound that felt almost unreal after the storm outside. She stared at the flames, letting the warmth sink in. Her body slowly began to respond, though the cold still lingered deep inside. When she finally spoke, her words came simply, without drama. She explained that she had nowhere to go, that she had been trying to reach a town farther down the road but couldn't make it. She didn't give many details, only what was necessary. He listened without interrupting, his expression calm but attentive. The rancher wasn't a man of many words. Years of working alone had taught him to listen more than speak. He could tell she wasn't lying. He could also tell she was close to her limit. Whatever had brought her there, it had taken everything she had left. He offered her soup, something hot and filling. She accepted with quiet gratitude, eating slowly, careful not to rush. Each spoonful felt like life returning to her body. As she ate, she glanced around the room. The house was modest but clean, filled with signs of a life built on routine and responsibility. Nothing fancy, just honest. As the night deepened, the storm outside showed no sign of stopping. Snow piled higher against the windows and the wind rattled the frames. The rancher checked outside once, then returned, shaking his head slightly. The roads were getting worse, not better. "You can stay here tonight," he said simply. "We'll figure out the rest in the morning." Relief washed over her face so strongly that her eyes filled, though she quickly looked down, embarrassed. She nodded, unable to find the right words to thank him. But as the minutes passed and the warmth settled in, another fear rose in her chest. Morning would come. And with it, questions. She knew she couldn't just stay one night and walk away. She had nowhere to walk to. She looked at the rancher sitting across from her, his face lit by firelight. This man didn't know her. He owed her nothing. And yet he had opened his door on the coldest night of the year. Her heart pounded as she realized that this moment, this house, this fire, this stranger, might be her last chance. Not just for the night, but for survival. Outside, Christmas Eve stretched on, silent and cold. Inside the ranch house, two lives that had never meant to cross now shared the same space, unaware that the choice she would soon make would change both of their futures forever. Morning came slowly, as if the world itself was tired from the long night. The storm had quieted, but the cold still held tight to the land. Pale light slipped through the windows of the ranch house, resting gently on the wooden floor. The fire in the hearth had burned low, leaving behind soft warmth and glowing embers. She woke up on the couch, wrapped in a thick blanket. For a moment, she didn't remember where she was. Then the smell of wood smoke and coffee reached her and memory returned. The ranch, the storm, the man who had opened his door when she had nowhere else to go. Her body felt heavy, but the sharp pain of the cold was gone. In its place was a deep tiredness, the kind that comes after fear has finally loosened its grip. She sat up slowly, careful not to disturb the quiet. The house felt different in daylight, less mysterious, more real. Sunlight revealed worn furniture, clean surfaces, and small signs of care. Boots lined near the door, a coat hung neatly on a hook, tools arranged with purpose. This was not a place of comfort built for show, but for living. From the kitchen came the sound of movement. The rancher stood at the counter, pouring coffee into 2 mugs. He had already been awake for hours. Morning chores did not wait for holidays. He glanced over when he heard her move and gave a small nod, not a smile, but not cold either. "You're awake," he said. "How are you feeling?" "Better," she replied honestly. Her voice still sounded weak but stronger than the night before. "Thank you for last night." He handed her a mug and gestured for her to sit at the small table. She wrapped her hands around the warmth, letting it soak in. For a while they drank in silence. It wasn't uncomfortable. It was simply 2 people sharing space, both unsure what came next. Outside, the land lay covered in fresh snow, untouched and bright. It looked peaceful, almost beautiful. She stared out the window, knowing that without this house, that beauty would have been deadly. "I don't want to cause trouble," she said finally, choosing her words carefully. "I'll leave as soon as I can." He studied her for a moment before responding. "The roads are bad," he said, "and the next town is miles away. It's not safe today." Her shoulders sank slightly, not in disappointment but in understanding. Staying longer meant facing reality, and reality was something she had been avoiding. She took a deep breath and told him more. Not everything, but enough. She spoke of losing her job, of packing up her life in a hurry, of trying to make it on her own without asking for help. She admitted that pride had kept her walking long after she should have stopped. She did not cry. The tears had already been spent on the road. He listened quietly, his hands resting on the table. When she finished, he leaned back in his chair and looked toward the window. "This ranch," he said slowly, "has been in my family for a long time. It's all I have." She nodded, unsure where this was going. "There are rules tied to it," he continued. "Old ones, legal ones. If I don't have a wife, certain relatives can step in, claim parts of it, maybe all." She blinked, surprised. "I didn't know places still worked like that." "They do," he said, "especially out here." The weight of his words settled between them. She realized then that he, too, was standing on fragile ground. Strong on the outside, steady in his routines, but vulnerable in ways that were hidden. She looked down at her mug, watching the steam rise. A thought had been growing quietly in her mind since the night before, forming slowly, carefully. It scared her, but the alternative scared her more. What if? She stopped, her heart racing. She wasn't sure how to say it without sounding foolish or desperate. He looked at her, waiting. "What if I stayed?" she said softly. "Not just for a day or two. What if I helped around the house, helped on the ranch?" He frowned slightly. "This isn't a charity," he said, not unkindly. "And people talk." She swallowed. This was the moment. If she backed down now, she would lose her chance. She lifted her head and met his eyes. "I know," she said. "That's why I'm asking something else." The room felt suddenly very still. Even the wind outside seemed to pause. She spoke slowly, choosing honesty over comfort. "If I stay here, let me stay as your wife." The words hung in the air, heavy and fragile at the same time. He stared at her, clearly shocked. He opened his mouth, then closed it again as if searching for the right response. He stood and walked a few steps away, running a hand through his hair. "That's not something you ask lightly," he said. "I know," she replied. Her voice trembled, but she did not look away. "And I wouldn't if I had another choice." Silence stretched between them. He paced once, then stopped near the window. Outside, the ranch stood quiet and unchanged, unaware of the decision being considered inside. "You barely know me," he said. "That's true," she admitted. "But I know this. I'll work. I'll respect your space. I won't pretend this is something it's not. We can be honest with each other." He turned back to her. "And what happens when winter ends?" Her chest tightened. She had asked herself that question 100 times already. "Then we decide," she said, "together." He returned to the table and sat down heavily. His face showed conflict, not desire, not excitement, but responsibility. He wasn't a man who acted on impulse. Every choice he made affected the land, the animals, and the life he had built. "This would have to be clear," he said. "Rules, boundaries," she nodded quickly. "Of course." "And no one gets hurt," he added. "No false promises." "I don't want promises," she said. "Just a chance." The clock on the wall ticked loudly, counting seconds that felt like minutes. Finally, he exhaled deeply. "I'll think about it," he said. "For today, you stay. We talk more later." Relief flooded her so suddenly that she had to grip the edge of the table to stay steady. It wasn't an answer, but it wasn't a rejection either. He stood and reached for his coat. "I have work to do outside," he said. "If you want to help, there's laundry that needs folding." She smiled faintly. "I can do that." As he stepped outside into the cold, she remained at the table, her heart pounding. She knew what she had asked was unusual. risky, but desperation had a way of stripping life down to what truly mattered. She began folding clothes, her movements slow and careful. Each simple task grounded her, reminding her that she was still here, still warm, still alive. Outside, the rancher moved through the snow, feeding animals and checking fences. His mind, however, was far from his work. The woman's words echoed in his head, her honesty, her fear, her courage. By the time he returned inside, he knew one thing for certain. Christmas Eve had brought more than a storm to his door. It had brought a choice that would change the course of both their lives, whether he was ready for it or not. The storm had finally passed, leaving the world outside sparkling and silent. Snow blanketed the fields and trees, untouched except for the faint tracks of animals. The morning sun reflected off the ice crystals, making everything shimmer as if the land had been covered in diamonds. Inside the ranch house, however, a different kind of warmth filled the space, a warmth that came from hearth and hope, from two people learning to navigate a life neither had planned. She awoke to the soft smell of coffee and fresh bread baking in the oven. The rancher had been up for hours, tending to chores before anyone else was awake. He moved through the house with quiet efficiency, pouring water for the animals, stacking firewood and preparing breakfast. She watched from the doorway, wrapped in a thick blanket, feeling both nervous and grateful. The night before, the cold had almost defeated her, but now she was safe, and somehow, being safe made her realize how much she had been alone in the world. After breakfast, they sat together at the table. The silence between them was no longer uncomfortable, it was thoughtful. She had decided carefully that she would accept the arrangement, whatever it meant, and he was considering it with his usual caution. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady but soft. "I want to help," she said, "not just to stay here but to contribute, to be useful." He studied her for a moment, his eyes unreadable. Then he nodded. "We'll see," he said. "There's always work. The land doesn't care about plans or feelings, it just needs attention." So she started. First, small tasks, folding laundry, sweeping floors, helping in the kitchen. Her hands were clumsy at first, and she often misjudged the weight of tools or baskets, but she learned quickly. The rancher watched her quietly, occasionally offering a tip or gentle correction. She appreciated the guidance, and even though she did not say it aloud, each small success felt like a step toward earning his trust. Days turned into a week, and the rhythm of the ranch life began to shape them both. She rose early with him to help feed the animals, gather eggs, and check fences. The cold mornings were harsh, but she found strength in routine. Every evening they returned to the house, muddy boots cleaned, hands raw from work, and a fire crackling in the hearth. It was exhausting, but it was honest work, and with each day she felt her fear and desperation slowly replaced by determination and a cautious sense of belonging. One afternoon, while repairing a section of the fence together, she tripped on a hidden patch of ice. He caught her quickly, steadying her before she could fall. She looked up at him, embarrassment and gratitude mingling in her expression. "Clumsy," she said, laughing nervously. He shook his head. "Careful, there's enough danger without adding to it." It was a small moment, but in it, she saw a glimmer of something she had not felt in years, kindness without judgment. His concern was real, practical, and yet gentle. She realized that despite the unusual circumstances, she was beginning to trust him. Evenings were the hardest. Sitting together by the fire, the house quiet except for the occasional creak of settling wood, they talked little. Words were not always necessary. Sometimes, sharing space and watching the flames dance in the hearth said more than speech ever could. But gradually, conversation began to flow. She told him small stories of her past, not the painful details but little memories of family holidays, childhood friends, and moments of joy. He listened, sometimes responding with a short comment, sometimes simply nodding. He did not pry, but the fact that he listened made her feel valued in a way she had not experienced before. They also learned to navigate boundaries. She respected his space, understanding that this house, this land, and this life had been his alone for years. He, in turn, adjusted his expectations, giving her tasks and responsibilities but not demanding perfection. It was a delicate balance, built on mutual respect and the unspoken understanding that they were partners in survival first, and perhaps more later. The days were not always smooth. Arguments arose, small disagreements about chores, priorities, or methods. She wanted to do things her way, he insisted on his. But each time they worked through the tension, learning not just about each other but about compromise. They discovered that communication, even in its simplest form, could prevent frustration from turning into resentment. One cold evening, she prepared a simple meal and set it on the table. He returned from the barn, his face wind-burned and tired, but he paused as he noticed her effort. "This looks good," he said quietly. "Thank you." She smiled, feeling warmth spread through her chest. It was a small acknowledgement, but it meant more than words could capture. Moments like these, ordinary yet profound, began to stitch their lives together in subtle ways. As winter pressed on, she began to take initiative. She learned to care for the animals, repair fences, and even drive the tractor when needed. Her confidence grew, not in grand gestures but in mastering the daily challenges of ranch life. She discovered satisfaction in seeing the land cared for, the animals fed, and the house maintained. Each completed task, no matter how small, reinforced her sense of purpose. The rancher observed her growth with quiet approval. He noticed how she adapted, how she persisted despite the harsh conditions and long hours. It was more than just survival. She was thriving, and it made him reconsider the arrangement they had stumbled into. Perhaps, he thought, this partnership could endure beyond necessity. They also began to share laughter, though rare, it was genuine. A spilled bucket of feed, a playful chase of a runaway goat, or a sudden gust of wind that flung snow into their faces, all became opportunities for connection. These small moments chipped away at the formality of their arrangement, leaving behind a simpler truth. They enjoyed each other's company. Evenings grew longer as winter deepened. They would sit together by the fire, the air filled with the smell of burning wood and the quiet hum of contentment. She sometimes dared to ask questions about his life, about his dreams, his past, and his losses. He shared cautiously, revealing snippets of his childhood on the ranch, the challenges of running it alone, and the loneliness that had settled in over the years. She listened, understanding that trust had to be earned, and that he was giving her pieces of himself that few ever saw. One particularly quiet night, after the animals were fed and the chores done, she dared to speak about her own fears. "I was so afraid last week," she admitted, staring into the fire. "I didn't know if I would survive the night. I didn't know if I could trust anyone to help me." He looked at her, his expression softening. "You trusted the wrong people before," he said quietly. "And you trusted me, I guess that matters." She nodded, the fire reflecting in her eyes. "It does," she said simply. Winter passed slowly, but with each day their partnership solidified. They were no longer just a woman seeking shelter and a man offering it. They had become a team, navigating challenges together, respecting boundaries, and discovering the small joys of life in each other's company. By the time the first hints of spring appeared in the snowmelt, both knew that what had started as a desperate arrangement was becoming something more meaningful. They had survived together, learned together, and in the quiet moments of shared work and companionship, they had begun to care. The rancher, once so guarded, found himself considering a future he had not imagined. And she, once so afraid of the night, the cold, and the world, discovered strength, resilience, and a sense of belonging she had not known she could have. The marriage, born of survival and necessity, was slowly transforming. It was no longer just about keeping her safe or protecting the ranch. It was about learning to trust, learning to share, and learning that even in the harshest winters, warmth could be found in the most unexpected places. And so, life on the ranch continued, with snow outside and growing warmth inside, a warmth built on work, respect, and the beginnings of something neither of them had expected, yet both silently hoped for. The days grew longer as winter slowly began to loosen its grip on the land. The sun rose higher each morning, melting the thick layers of snow that had blanketed the fields for weeks. The world outside the ranch was changing, but inside, life was settling into a rhythm that neither of them had expected. She had learned to rise before dawn, feed the animals, check fences, and help wherever she could. Each day brought new challenges, but she faced them with a quiet determination that impressed the rancher more than she could know. She had been living in the ranch for weeks now. What had started as a desperate plea for shelter on Christmas Eve had become a structured routine. She no longer stumbled through chores in uncertainty. She moved with purpose, understanding the rhythm of the ranch, the needs of the animals, and the timing of the work that had to be done. Even the smallest tasks, stacking firewood, sweeping the porch, washing dishes, felt meaningful because they were part of a larger life, a life she had almost lost. The rancher watched her from time to time, his eyes taking in her concentration, her care, and her persistence. He noticed how she handled the animals with gentle hands, how she learned quickly where each tool belonged, how she anticipated the small needs before he even asked. At first, he had been cautious, unsure of trusting someone new in his life and on his land. But her consistency, her honesty, and her effort began to break down the walls he had built over years of solitude. Despite the routine, evenings were still the hardest moments for both of them. After long hours outside, they would sit near the fire, quiet but not uncomfortable. Sometimes words came. Sometimes there was only the soft crackle of the flames and the occasional wind rattling the windows. She would often watch him as he sipped his coffee or read by the light of the fire, wondering what he thought about the unusual circumstances that had brought them together. Gradually, the silence was filled with small conversations. She would ask about the ranch, the animals, or the land. He would answer with short, precise replies, often sharing stories from his past, how he had taken over the ranch after his parents passed, how he learned to repair the fences and care for the cattle, the winters that had tested him. She listened carefully, not pressing for details she did not need, but appreciating the glimpses into the life he had led alone. Her own stories began to surface as well, not the painful ones that had driven her to desperation, but small, everyday memories that revealed her personality and her heart. She told him about childhood Christmases, the smell of fresh-baked cookies in her grandmother's kitchen, the sound of snow crunching under her boots. She told him about ordinary moments that mattered, a favorite book, a walk in the park, the joy of completing a small task perfectly. These stories were simple, but they created connection, a thread between two lives that had collided unexpectedly. One morning, while checking the fences, a sudden gust of wind caught her off guard. She slipped on an icy patch, falling hard onto the snow-covered ground. The rancher was immediately there, pulling her up and steadying her. "Careful," he said, his voice low but firm. "You're stronger than you think, but you don't have to test it all the time." She laughed nervously, brushing the snow off her coat. "I'm not clumsy, just careful," she replied, trying to lighten the moment. He shook his head, a small smile tugging at his lips, and helped her finish the fence repair. The incident, though minor, marked a moment of trust and mutual reliance. They realized they could rely on each other in ways that went beyond routine tasks. They could rely on each other in moments of vulnerability. As the weeks passed, she began to take initiative. She started preparing meals without being asked, planning chores for the day, and anticipating the needs of the ranch. Her confidence grew as she mastered the rhythm of life on the ranch. The animals responded to her gentle care, the chores were done efficiently, and even the small details, tidying up, keeping track of tools, making sure the fire stayed lit, added to a sense of order and purpose. The rancher noticed this, and it impressed him silently. They also began to share laughter, moments that were rare but genuine. A goat that refused to cooperate, a spilled bucket of feed, or a sudden gust of wind flinging snow into their faces became opportunities for humor and connection. These small, joyful moments chipped away at the formality of their arrangement, leaving behind a simple truth. They enjoyed each other's company. Trust deepened as they worked side by side. She saw the care he put into everything, how he tended to the animals, checked the fences, and preserved the land. She realized that his life, though lonely at times, was filled with responsibility and love for the work he had chosen. He saw her determination, her reliability, and her willingness to learn. He realized that she was more than someone who needed shelter. She was a partner, someone who could share the weight of the land and life. Evenings continued to be a time of quiet reflection. Sitting by the fire, she sometimes dared to ask questions about his past, about his childhood, or about what had shaped him. He answered cautiously, sharing pieces of himself he had never revealed to anyone else. In return, she shared small details of her own life, creating an understanding that went beyond words. They began to see each other not as strangers or mere companions, but as people who could depend on each other. One night after a long day of chores, they sat in silence by the fire. The air smelled of burning wood and warm blankets. She turned to him, hesitant but determined. "I was afraid," she admitted softly. "Last week I didn't know if I would survive the night. I didn't know if I could trust anyone." He looked at her, his expression softening. "You trusted the wrong people before," he said, "and you trusted me, that matters." She nodded, feeling warmth spread through her chest. The acknowledgement was small, but it meant more than words could capture. She realized that trust had become possible slowly, through shared work, shared space, and shared quiet moments. Spring began to make its presence known. Snow melted into streams, fields revealed the first signs of green, and the days grew longer. Life on the ranch shifted, but the bond they had developed remained strong. She had proven herself, not only as someone capable of surviving on the ranch, but as someone who could contribute meaningfully to its care and management. The rancher found himself thinking about her often. He noticed her determination, her reliability, and her willingness to embrace this unexpected life. He began to consider the possibility that their partnership could endure beyond winter, that what had started as necessity could transform into something lasting. They had survived the harshest part of winter together. They had learned to communicate, to rely on each other, and to appreciate the small joys that life offered. What had begun as a desperate arrangement had grown into something meaningful. Respect, trust, and quiet affection had taken root, and neither could ignore it any longer. The rancher, once so guarded, began to open his heart. He realized that she was no longer just a woman seeking shelter. She was a companion, someone who could share the responsibilities, the challenges, and the rewards of life on the ranch. She, in turn, realized that she had found more than safety and warmth. She had found a place where she belonged, a life where her efforts mattered, and a man who had become more than a stranger. Their days continued, filled with work, laughter, and quiet reflection. They shared tasks and responsibilities, celebrated small victories, and supported each other in moments of difficulty. The trust they had built became the foundation of a growing bond, one that neither had expected but both silently hoped for. As the snow finally disappeared and the first signs of spring brightened the fields, they both understood that their lives had changed in ways neither could have predicted. The arrangement born of necessity had evolved into a partnership rooted in trust, respect, and mutual care. Winter had tested them, challenged them, and forced them to rely on one another. Now, as the seasons shifted, they faced the future together, stronger, wiser, and more connected than they had ever imagined. In the quiet of the ranch house, with the sun streaming through the windows, they realized that survival had led them to something far greater, a bond that could endure beyond the cold, beyond fear, and beyond the uncertainties that had once shaped their lives. They had learned to trust, to care, and to hope together, discovering that warmth, safety, and companionship could be found even in the harshest of winters. The first signs of spring brought change not only to the land but to their lives. The snow melted in patches, streams began to flow freely, and the fields revealed their hidden green under the thawing earth. The cold that had defined the past months was retreating, leaving behind the warmth of longer days and bright sunlight. For her, this change brought both relief and unease. Winter had been their shield, giving her a reason to stay and him a reason to accept her presence. Now that the season was ending, questions loomed about what came next. She rose early as usual, the crisp morning air filled with the scent of wet earth and the faint perfume of new grass. The ranch was alive with sounds, the lowing of cattle, the clucking of hens, and the occasional bark of a dog. The routine was familiar, and yet today felt different. The weight of the coming decision pressed quietly on her, threading through every chore and every glance exchanged with the rancher. They worked together silently, repairing fences where the snow had damaged posts, feeding the animals with renewed energy, and checking each corner of the property for signs of lingering winter hazards. The rhythm of labor was comforting, grounding her in the reality that life went on outside of fear and uncertainty. But in moments when they paused, leaning on shovels or sipping water, there was a subtle tension, unspoken yet present. After the morning chores, they returned to the house. She prepared a simple breakfast, as she had grown accustomed to doing, setting the table and arranging the plates carefully. The rancher watched her, noticing how her movements had become confident, deliberate, and at ease. It was remarkable, he thought, how someone who had arrived trembling and afraid weeks ago could now manage the ranch with such capability and poise. She caught his gaze, and for the first time she saw something different in his eyes. There was an emotion she could not name at first, something softer than respect, deeper than approval. It made her heart flutter nervously, but she focused on the present, determined not to let her thoughts distract her from the tasks at hand. The morning passed in routine chores, but the thought of the conversation they would eventually have lingered like a shadow. She knew she could not rely on winter as an excuse anymore. She had to confront reality. The arrangement they had made had begun in desperation, but now she wanted something more, something real, something lasting. That afternoon, after finishing with the barn, they sat on the porch overlooking the fields. The sun was warm, a gentle promise of spring, and the air was filled with the sounds of life returning. She turned to him, gathering courage. "I've been thinking," she began, her voice quiet but steady. "Winter brought me here, yes, but it also gave me something I didn't expect. I've learned, I've grown, and I feel like I belong here." He listened, leaning back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "I don't want to leave," she continued, her eyes searching his. "I don't want this to end because the snow has melted. I want to stay with you. Not just for shelter, not just for winter, but for life." The rancher was silent, staring out at the fields for a long moment. His mind raced with considerations, practical, emotional, and moral. He thought about the trust they had built, the shared work, and the subtle bond that had grown over weeks. He thought about the loneliness he had felt for years, and the unexpected warmth her presence had brought. Finally, he turned to her. "This isn't just about staying," he said carefully. "It's about choice. It's about us both being willing, not out of fear or need, but because we want it." She nodded, relief and hope mingling in her chest. "I want it," she said simply. He studied her for a moment longer, then spoke, his voice quiet but firm. "Then we do it properly. We don't just continue as we have. We choose each other." Her heart lifted at his words. It was as if the walls around them, built over months of cautious interaction and silent observation, had finally begun to fall. The future, uncertain and daunting only days ago, now seemed bright with possibility. The next days were filled with new routines. They worked side by side, not just out of necessity, but as partners who had chosen to share a life. She continued to care for the animals, manage the household, and assist in the field, but now there was a sense of equality in their interactions. He included her in decisions about the ranch, valued her opinions, and sought her insight on matters he would previously have handled alone. Evenings were no longer merely about quiet companionship. They shared stories of hopes, fears, and dreams. She laughed freely now without fear of judgment, and he began to respond in kind, sharing small jokes, stories from his youth, and even occasional smiles that reached his eyes. The trust they had built deepened, becoming the foundation of something far greater than survival. It became connection, partnership, and love. One night, as the stars twinkled over the dark fields, she spoke about her gratitude. "I never imagined," she said softly, "that asking for shelter would lead to this, that I could find not just safety but a home and someone I can truly rely on." He reached out and took her hand, an action both tender and deliberate. "Neither did I," he admitted. "Life has a strange way of giving you more than you expect if you let it." As spring continued, they celebrated the small joys of life together, planting the first seeds in the garden, fixing a fence after a storm, or simply sitting together watching the sun set over the fields. Each day was filled with ordinary tasks, but they now carried extraordinary meaning because they faced them together. The town began to notice the change as well. Neighbors saw them working together, heard their laughter, and gradually accepted that this was no temporary arrangement. What had begun as a desperate plea for shelter had transformed into a partnership grounded in respect, trust, and mutual support. By the time the snow had fully melted and green grass covered the fields, the rancher knew that winter had not only tested them but had prepared them for the future. They had survived the cold, relied on each other through hardships, and discovered a bond stronger than either had anticipated. She had found strength, resilience, and purpose, while he had rediscovered warmth, companionship, and hope. One evening, after a long day of work, they sat by the fire in the ranch house, the room glowing with soft light. She rested her head on his shoulder, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. "I'm glad I asked," she whispered. He held her gently. "So am I," he said. "So am I." The choice they had made, to stay, to trust, to build a life together, was no longer just about surviving the cold or the storm. It was about creating a home, nurturing a partnership, and embracing a future that neither had imagined but both now cherished. The love that had grown slowly, quietly, and surely was no longer tentative. It was real, lasting, and deep. Spring had brought more than warmth to the land. It had brought clarity to their hearts. They had moved from desperation to choice, from necessity to love, and from uncertainty to commitment. What began as a plea on a cold Christmas Eve had become a story of trust, partnership, and the courage to embrace life fully together. As they looked out over the ranch, hand in hand, they understood that this was just the beginning. Winter had taught them survival, the days together had built trust, and now, with spring in full bloom, they could step confidently into a future they would create together, side by side, heart to heart, as partners in life and in love. And so, the woman who had nearly frozen on Christmas Eve had not only found warmth and safety, she had found a home, a life, and a man willing to build a future with her. The rancher, once solitary, had not only offered shelter but had discovered companionship, trust, and the quiet strength of love born from choice, courage, and the simple act of opening one's door on the coldest night of the year. Together they stepped into spring, ready for every challenge, every joy, and every moment that life would offer, knowing that whatever came, they would face it as one.